The first time Ezra Loomis called me ugly, I was standing in front of his entire family. Not the enslaved people, not the overseers, his family, his wife, his 3 sons, his mother, who had come from Mobile for the Christmas gathering, and who sat in her chair by the fireplace with the expression of a woman who had decided decades ago that the world was exactly as cruel as it needed to be, and had made her peace with that. His 2 daughters, both of them in the white dresses their mother had commissioned for the occasion. His brother and his brother's wife and their 4 children, all of them arranged around the parlor of the Loomis Plantation house in Marengo County, Alabama, in the particular formation of a family that is performing its own prosperity for itself. I had been brought in to serve the Christmas dinner. I was 22 years old. I had been on the Loomis Plantation for 4 years, assigned to the house after spending the first year in the fields, the reassignment coming not because anyone had decided I was suited for housework, but because the previous housegirl had run, and I was available, and Ezra Loomis needed the position filled before his wife Margaret complained about it again. I was not chosen. I was substituted. There is a difference, and I felt it in the quality of the work I was given and the quality of the attention I received from the people I served. The attention from Margaret Loomis was the kind that looks for things wrong. The attention from her husband was the kind that does not look at all, until that Christmas evening when he looked. I was carrying the second platter of roast pork from the kitchen when he looked up from his conversation with his brother and saw me and said, without lowering his voice or adjusting his tone in any way that suggested the observation was not meant to be heard, that he had no idea where Margaret had found this one, but she was the most unfortunate-looking creature he had ever had in his house. His mother laughed, a small, dry sound. His brother looked at me with the mild curiosity of a man appraising livestock that had been described unfavorably. His wife said, "Ezra and nothing else," which was what she said in response to most things he said, and which meant approximately nothing. His daughters did not look up from their plates. I set the platter on the table and stepped back to the position of a person waiting to be needed, and I kept my face exactly as it was. Not blank. Blank was its own kind of statement that men like Ezra Loomis read as insolence. I kept it at the expression I had been practicing since the day I arrived on his plantation, the expression that said, "I am here, and I am nothing, and I require no accommodation from you or from the world you have built, and I will be exactly where you put me, and nothing more." He looked at me for another moment with the clinical detachment of someone deciding whether an ugly object was at least functional. Then he said, "As long as she's useful, I suppose it doesn't matter." He turned back to his brother. I stood in my position, and I breathed, and I took what he had said, and I put it in a place inside myself that I had been building since I was old enough to understand that I needed somewhere to put things, a place where the things I could not respond to in the moment could be kept until the moment came when responding was possible. I was not ugly. I want to say that clearly and without apology before I tell you the rest of this story. I know what I am. I have always known what I am. I have eyes, and I have used them, and what they have shown me when I have looked at myself in the reflective surfaces available to me across my life has never been what Ezra Loomis described. I have my mother's face, which was a good face, a strong face, a face that my father, who was sold away before I was 5, told her was the finest thing he had ever seen. I have height that the women in my family carried with the particular uprightness of people who understood that how you held your body was the one form of dignity that could not be taken from you without your cooperation. I have hands that are large and capable, and that have never failed me in anything I have asked them to do. I was not ugly. What I was inconvenient. And inconvenient was something that Ezra Loomis found intolerable in the people he owned. He wanted his enslaved people to be visually manageable, to fit into his idea of what they should be, to occupy the space he assigned them without excess, without particularity, without anything that made them more present than the function they served required. I was too tall for his idea. My face was too direct. I looked at things with attention that made people uncomfortable because it was the attention of someone who was actually seeing what was in front of her, rather than performing the selective blindness that service required. He called me ugly because ugly was the word that put me in a category he could manage. Useless followed 3 months later, in March of 1854, when I broke a piece of Margaret Loomis's china while washing it. Not from carelessness. The piece had a crack in it that had been there long before I touched it, a crack that ran along the base and that I had seen the first time I washed it, and had mentioned to the head housewoman, a woman named Bertha, who had told me to be careful with it and said nothing to Margaret, because telling Margaret things created more problems than it solved. The piece broke along the crack exactly as a piece with a crack in it will break when enough washings have worked their way into the weakness, Margaret told her husband. Her husband came to the kitchen and looked at the broken pieces arranged on the counter where I had placed them, and then looked at me and said, with the same declarative certainty he brought to everything, that I was useless and that he did not know why Margaret kept me in the house, and that if I broke one more thing, I would go back to the fields and stay there. I said, "Yes, sir." He left. Bertha, who had witnessed this from the doorway, looked at me when he was gone with the expression of someone who has survived many versions of this particular scene and knows its grammar well enough to read what comes next. "Don't give him a reason," she said. "He doesn't need one," I said. "No." She turned back to the stove. "But don't give him one anyway." I took her advice. For 3 years I took her advice. For 3 years I was in that house and I gave Ezra Loomis no reason. I washed dishes with the care of someone who understood that the dishes were not dishes, but tests. I served meals with the precision of someone performing a ceremony where any deviation from the established form would be noted and catalogued. I moved through the Loomis house with the particular invisibility that house servants learned, the quality of presence that registered as absence, that allowed a person to be in a room and out of it simultaneously. And I watched everything. This was what they did not understand about calling a person ugly and useless. What they did not understand was that a person they had decided required no further consideration was a person they had stopped watching. And a person they had stopped watching could see everything. I saw the Loomis plantation clearly in ways that Ezra Loomis could not see it, because he was inside it in the way that people are inside the things they have built, unable to perceive the structure because they are the structure. I was outside it in the way that people are outside the things they serve, able to see the whole shape because they are not part of it. What I saw was this. The Loomis plantation in Marengo County, Alabama, covered 4,000 acres of prime cotton land, worked by 119 enslaved people. It was profitable in the way that plantations in the Alabama Black Belt were profitable in the 1850s, which was substantially because the soil was rich and the cotton market was strong, and the labor was free in the sense that slavery made labor free, meaning it was extracted rather than purchased, and the people doing it had no recourse. Ezra Loomis was 44 years old and had inherited the plantation from his father at the age of 28. He had expanded it in the years since through 3 land purchases and 2 acquisitions of neighboring enslaved populations when neighboring operations failed. He was not a cruel man in the way that some men were cruel, with deliberate inventiveness and personal satisfaction in the suffering he produced. He was cruel in the more common way, with indifference and efficiency, treating the people he owned as inputs to a production process and managing them with the same emotional register he applied to soil quality or equipment maintenance. He was also beneath the confidence that his position required him to project, afraid. I identified this in the 2nd year, not immediately. Fear in men like Ezra Loomis is heavily concealed, buried under authority and social performance and the daily reinforcement of a world that is organized to tell them they have no reason to be afraid. But it is there. It has to be there, because what they are doing is objectively terrifying when perceived honestly, and some part of them perceives it honestly regardless of what the rest of them does with that perception. What Ezra Loomis was afraid of was exactly what he should have been afraid of. He was afraid of the people he owned, not specifically, not with the concrete fear that attaches to a known threat, with the ambient, unlocated fear of someone who understands, without being able to say he understands it, that he is standing on ground that could move, that the system holding everything in place was a system, meaning it was constructed, meaning it was not natural, meaning it had been built and could be unbuilt, that the 119 people who produced his prosperity were 119 people, meaning they had minds and intentions and the capacity for coordinated action that his prosperity required him to prevent. He managed this fear through control. Rigid, comprehensive, exhausting control of every variable he could identify. The labor schedule, which was documented and enforced with the precision of someone who believed that precision itself was a form of safety. The movement of enslaved people on and off the property, which required passes signed by him personally for any trip beyond the plantation's boundaries. The social life of the quarters, which he monitored through a network of information that he had built over years by identifying which enslaved people would tell him things in exchange for small privileges. I knew about the network within 6 months. I knew who the informants were, which of them reported willingly, and which of them reported under pressure, what categories of information each one passed along and what categories they withheld. I knew this because I watched and because I listened with the particular attention of someone who had decided that everything she heard was relevant until proven otherwise. I did not avoid the informants. I was careful with them in the way you are careful with any tool that someone else is using and that you need to either work around or repurpose. I repurposed 2 of them. This took 18 months of careful relationship building, conducted with the patience of someone who understood that trust between people in impossible circumstances was the most valuable currency available and could not be rushed without being destroyed. By the end of 1855, I had 2 people in Ezra Loomis's information network who reported to him what I told them to report and withheld what I told them to withhold. They did this not for privilege, but because I had spent 18 months demonstrating that I understood what I was doing and why and what it could produce, and they had decided that was worth the risk. It was worth the risk. But I am moving faster than the story allows. Let me go back to what I was watching and learning in those first years. The Loomis Plantation's cotton operation had one critical vulnerability that Ezra Loomis knew about and managed carefully, and one that he did not know about, because he had never looked at his operation from the position that would have made it visible. The one he knew about was the gin house. The cotton gin was the pivot point of the entire operation. Without it, raw cotton was worthless. The machinery was complex and prone to the particular failures that machinery in high-stress environments produces, and the man who maintained it was an enslaved mechanic named Solomon, who had learned the gin's workings over 15 years, and whose knowledge of it exceeded anyone else's on the plantation, including the white gin operator who nominally supervised him, but who in practice relied on Solomon for every significant decision about the machine's management. Solomon was 51 years old and was the most valuable person on the Loomis plantation in the purely financial sense of that word, and knew it, and had spent 15 years carefully not knowing it in any way that was visible to Ezra Loomis. He was quiet and methodical, and had survived on the plantation longer than anyone else by the simple discipline of giving no one a reason to look at him too carefully. I found Solomon in my first month. I found him because I was looking for him. I was looking for him because I was looking for the thing that the plantation could not function without. And the gin house was the obvious answer. But the gin house was a building, and buildings could be rebuilt. So what I was actually looking for was the knowledge that the gin house required, and knowledge lived in people. It lived in Solomon. I did not speak to Solomon about what I was thinking for 2 years. 2 years of parallel observation, of learning his rhythms and his character, and the quality of his judgment, of giving him the opportunity to see the quality of mine. At the end of 2 years, I knew that Solomon was not only the person whose knowledge the plantation most depended on, but also the person who had thought most carefully about the gap between what his knowledge was worth and what he received for it, and about what that gap implied. He had thought about it for 15 years. We talked in November of 1855. Not at length, not in detail. A conversation whose content could have been described as a discussion of the weather if anyone had been listening, but whose actual content was a mutual acknowledgement that we had both been thinking about the same question from different angles and had arrived at compatible conclusions. The question was not whether, but how. Now let me tell you about the vulnerability that Ezra Loomis did not know about. It was his wife, not Margaret herself exactly. Margaret Loomis was a woman of limited imagination and unlimited attention to social convention who had organized her entire interior life around the performance of the role she occupied and who had very little access to anything below the surface of that performance. She was not dangerous and not capable of being made dangerous. What she was capable of was being made into a conduit. What I mean is this: Margaret Loomis corresponded with 43 people. I know this because I organized the household mail for 4 years, and I have the particular memory of someone who has trained herself to retain everything she processes because she does not know in advance what will be useful. 43 correspondents, including her sister in Montgomery, her former schoolmate in Tuscaloosa who had married a banker, 3 women from her social circle in Demopolis, and her husband's business contacts in Mobile and Selma, whose letters passed through the household mail, and whose contents she sometimes read before passing them to her husband. She read her husband's business correspondence because she was bored, and because it was available, and because reading it gave her a sense of participation in the operation of her life that the actual operation of her life did not provide. She had never considered that someone else might read it after her. I read everything that came through the Loomis household mail for 4 years. I understood Ezra Loomis's business relationships in their complete detail. I understood his credit arrangements with a factor in Mobile named Whitmore and with a merchant in Selma named Calder. I understood the terms of a land purchase he had made in 1853 that had been financed through a private note held by a man named Beauchamp in Montgomery, a note whose terms included a provision that gave Beauchamp certain rights over the property if the note was not serviced on schedule. I understood the one thing that Ezra Loomis would not have wanted understood: that he was extended further than he appeared. The 4,000 acres and the 119 people, and the large house with its Christmas gatherings and its china and its roast pork and its comfortable certainty were constructed on a financial foundation that was less solid than they made it look. The cotton prices of 1850 and 1851 had encouraged him to expand beyond what the more cautious prices of the following years could comfortably support. He had managed this gap through the kind of financial maneuvering that works until it doesn't, restructuring and deferring and relying on the assumption that the next season would be better. The next season was not always better. By 1856, the 3rd year of my careful observation, I had a complete picture of the Loomis plantation's actual situation, its visible prosperity and its hidden strain, its public confidence and its private anxiety. Its 119 people and its gin house and its Solomon and its Margaret and its 43 correspondents and its factor in Mobile and its merchant in Selma and its note in Montgomery. And I had a picture of Ezra Loomis, the man who had called me ugly in front of his family and useless in front of his wife, and had then stopped seeing me because ugly and useless were categories that required no further attention, who had spent 4 years walking past me in his own house without looking because he had decided I was furniture, and furniture did not need to be watched, who had given me 4 years of watching him while he was not watching. I began in January of 1857. The first thing I did was write a letter. I wrote it at night in my room in the house, by the light of a candle stub. On paper I had accumulated 1 sheet at a time from the household supply over 6 months, in quantities too small to notice. I wrote in a hand that was not my own, because what I wrote needed to be able to have come from anyone, and I had spent 6 months practicing the formal commercial style of the business correspondence that passed through the Loomis house, and that I had read so many times I could reproduce its conventions without effort. The letter went to Whitmore, the factor in Mobile. It informed him, in the language of someone with professional knowledge of the Loomis operations finances, that certain information had come to the writer's attention, suggesting that the situation of the Loomis account was materially worse than the account holder had disclosed, and that the writer felt a professional obligation to bring this to Whitmore's attention before the spring factor arrangements were finalized. The letter was accurate. Everything in it was true. I had read the documents. I knew the numbers. I wrote only what was real. I sent it through a free black man in Demopolis named August, who moved between Marengo County and Mobile on a regular basis for commercial reasons, and who, through a chain of relationships I had built over 2 years of careful and patient connection-making, had agreed to carry certain things without asking what they contained. Whitmore received the letter and began asking questions. The questions arrived at the Loomis plantation in February in the form of a letter to Ezra Loomis requesting clarification of several points in the account's status. Ezra Loomis was surprised by the questions and irritated by them, and spent 3 days drafting a response that addressed the surface of what had been asked without revealing the substance beneath it. Whitmore was not satisfied. He sent a representative to Marengo County in March. The representative's visit produced a conversation I did not witness, but whose results I observed in Ezra Loomis's face when he returned to the house afterward, the face of a man who has just had a conversation that confirmed something he had been hoping was not true. The face of a man whose control of his own situation has just become visible to him as less complete than he had maintained. He sat in his study for the rest of the afternoon. I served his dinner without incident. He did not look at me. In April, I wrote to Calder in Selma. In May, I wrote to Beauchamp in Montgomery. Each letter contained true information. Each letter was tailored to the specific relationship and the specific concerns that the specific recipient would find most relevant to their professional or financial interests. Calder was concerned about the value of the cotton operation as security for the credit extended. Beauchamp was concerned about the provision in his note and whether the property that secured it was being properly maintained. Both letters gave them accurate reasons to look more carefully at their relationship with Ezra Loomis than they had been looking. Both of them looked. By the summer of 1857, Ezra Loomis was managing 3 simultaneous relationships with creditors and business partners who had become, suddenly and without explanation, he could identify, more attentive to the details of his operation than they had previously been. Each conversation required energy. Each clarification required disclosure he had not intended to make. The combined pressure of 3 careful, professionally motivated examinations of his financial situation was producing exactly the effect that 3 separate examinations, each one responding to the same accurate information from the same anonymous source, would produce. Strain. Visible, measurable, cumulative strain on a financial structure that had been designed to function when no one was looking at it too carefully. He began sleeping poorly. I knew this because I heard him in the house at night, the particular sounds of a man who wakes at 3 in the morning and cannot return to sleep. The footsteps between the bedroom and the study, the sound of the study door, the silence that meant he was sitting with his papers and his arithmetic, and the growing awareness that the arithmetic was not resolving the way he needed it to resolve. He became shorter with everyone around him. Margaret absorbed most of this, which was what Margaret did. The overseers absorbed some of it, which was what overseers did. The house became tighter, the atmosphere in it denser with the particular pressure of a man whose anxiety is looking for somewhere to go. He called me ugly again in August. It was different this time. Not the casual declaration of the Christmas evening, the offhand categorization of a man who had not really looked. This time he was in the kitchen when I was there, and he looked at me with the focused attention of someone searching for something to be angry at, and he said it with the specific energy of a man who needs a target and has found one. I said nothing. I kept my face at the expression I had been keeping it at for 4 years. He said something else, that I was useless and had always been useless, and that the only reason he had kept me in the house this long was that Margaret seemed to want me there, and he had more important things to think about than the staffing of his kitchen. I said, "Yes, sir." He left. I stood in the kitchen after he left, and I breathed, and I thought about the letter I had already written to Beauchamp that was sitting in August's keeping in Demopolis, waiting for the right moment to be sent. The right moment was September. Beauchamp's letter arrived at the Loomis plantation in October. I know what it said, because I organized the mail and I read it before I gave it to Margaret, who gave it to her husband. It said that given the questions that had arisen over the summer regarding the property's financial status, Beauchamp had consulted his lawyer and believed it was appropriate to request a formal accounting of the note's security before the end of the year. A formal accounting. The language of the letter was polite and professional and devastating, because what it meant in the practical reality of Ezra Loomis's situation was that Beauchamp was considering exercising the provision in the note, and that the exercise of that provision would require Loomis to produce resources he did not have. Ezra Loomis read the letter in his study, and I heard from the hallway outside the study door where I was performing the entirely legitimate task of cleaning the hall floor, the sound of a man putting a piece of paper down on a desk with the particular deliberateness of someone who needs to do something with his hands that is not the thing he actually wants to do with them. Solomon came to me in November, not to my room, in the way that people come to each other on plantations, in the margins of the day in passing, in the brief, unobserved spaces between the observed ones. He said two words that contained everything, almost time. I nodded. He moved on. I had not told Solomon what I had been doing. I did not need to. What I had been doing was invisible by design, and what Solomon knew was what the plantation told him through its own rhythms: the increased tension, the owner's changed behavior, the overseer's tightened management, the quality of the air over the operation that anyone paying attention could read as the quality of a thing about to change. Solomon was paying attention. He had been paying attention for 15 years. In December, the gin began failing. Not catastrophically. Not in the way that would produce an obvious event that could be investigated and blamed, in the way that complex machinery fails when maintained by someone who knows exactly where to apply the minimum intervention that will produce the maximum result. A bearing that ran slightly warmer than optimal, a timing adjustment that was not quite where it should have been, a lubrication schedule that had been shifted by a day and a half in a way that was within normal variation and would not have been noticed by anyone who did not know the gin as well as Solomon knew it. The 1857 cotton harvest was the worst the Loomis plantation had produced in a decade. Not a disaster. A disaster could have been absorbed, explained, attributed to weather or market or the legitimate misfortunes that agricultural operations produce. This was something more subtle and therefore more damaging. A shortfall. A performance that was below what the operation should have produced given the inputs, that could not be attributed to anything external, that sat in the financial documents as evidence of internal failure. Internal failure was what Beauchamp's lawyer was looking for when he arrived in January of 1858 to conduct the formal accounting. He found it. The accounting produced by the lawyer's examination of the Loomis plantation's records over 3 days in January of 1858 was a document that Ezra Loomis had not expected and could not have prevented because its contents were true, and the truth of them had been building for years under the accumulated pressure of 3 business relationships that had become, over the course of 1857, much more careful about the Loomis account than they had been before someone had given them accurate reasons to be careful. The note was called in February. I will not detail what followed because what followed was legal and financial and impersonal and moved at the pace of those processes, which is slower than the pace of human urgency but more thorough. What I will tell you is what it produced. By the summer of 1858, the Loomis plantation in Marengo County, Alabama, was in formal legal proceedings. By the autumn, it was in the process of being sold to satisfy the debts that the calling of the note had made immediately due, and that the shortfall of the 1857 harvest had made impossible to meet through operations. The house was sold. The land was sold. The cotton gin was sold. 119 people were sold, redistributed through the market in lots that the proceedings required, separated from the community that 4 years of my watching and working had not been enough to protect them from the final dispersal that sale always produced. I cannot tell you that this does not sit in me as failure. I can tell you that the alternative, the continuation of the Loomis plantation under Ezra Loomis's management for another decade or 2 decades, or until some external force intervened, produced a calculation in which the dispersal was the lesser loss. I made that calculation before I began. I sat with it until I was certain I was seeing it clearly and not through the distortion of what I wanted it to say. I made it again after. The calculation held. What I can tell you is what happened to Ezra Loomis. He was not destroyed financially in the sense of being left with nothing. He was a white man in Alabama in 1858, and white men in Alabama in 1858 had resources available to them that failure could not entirely remove. He had family in Mobile. He had social connections that survived the loss of the plantation's visible prosperity. He had eventually a smaller operation in a different county, a reduced version of what he had built, a life that was recognizably connected to the one he had lived before, but smaller in every dimension that had mattered to him. He had lost what he valued most, not the money, not even the land, the scale, the presence, the capacity to stand in a room and be the largest thing in it, not physically but socially, the way that a man who owns 4,000 acres and 119 people is always the largest thing in any room he enters in Marengo County, Alabama. He lost that. And in losing it, he became a man who had to reckon with what it meant to have had it, and lost it without understanding why, which is its own particular form of punishment, more complete in some ways than the ones that have visible causes, because there is nowhere to direct the reckoning except inward. I was not present for his reckoning. I had been sold in the dispersal of the Loomis people to a small farm outside Greensboro, Alabama, and from there, through the processes of the following years, found my way eventually to freedom in 1865, when the war ended and the system that had organized my life and the lives of everyone I knew collapsed under the weight of the contradictions that had always been inside it. I settled in Greensboro. I was 30 years old in 1865. I had been watching and learning and working with what I knew since I was 22, and had stood in the Loomis parlor holding a platter of roast pork, while a man told his family I was the most unfortunate-looking creature he had ever had in his house. What I had been in that house was the most dangerous thing he had ever had in his house. He never knew. That was always the point. The thing about being called ugly is that it is meant to make you smaller, to reduce you to a surface that can be assessed and found insufficient, and therefore dismissed, to put you in a category that requires no further examination, to make you into something that takes up space without mattering, that can be named and filed and forgotten. What it actually does when the person being called ugly has any sense at all is make them invisible. And invisible is not small. Invisible is the most powerful thing a person can be in a house full of people who have decided they know exactly what you are. Ezra Loomis decided he knew exactly what I was on a Christmas evening in 1853, when he looked at me across a parlor full of his family and said ugly and useless out loud in front of all of them. He spent the next 4 years living with the consequences of that decision without knowing they were consequences. He spent 4 years walking past me in his own house without looking, 4 years of not looking at the thing that was watching him. I was never ugly. I was never useless. I was the one thing his whole plantation feared, and the fear was appropriate, and the only mistake they made about it was that they were afraid of the wrong thing. They feared the dramatic, the visible, the loud resistance that announces itself and can be identified and crushed. They should have feared the quiet. The woman standing in the correct position, holding the correct platter with the correct expression, learning everything about the house she was standing in, while the house was not watching because the house had already decided what she was, and felt no need to look again. They should have feared the letters. They should have feared the patience. They should have feared the 4 years of watching that produced a knowledge of their operation so complete that the operation could be taken apart from the inside, by someone who understood it better than the man who built it, because the man who built it had stopped looking at it, and she never had. My name is Cora, not the name in his ledger, not the name on the deed of sale. My mother's name for me, the name she said when she was nursing me, and when she was braiding my hair, and when she was teaching me to read in the quiet of the evenings when the quarters were settling towards sleep. The name she said when she looked at my face and saw whatever she saw there, which was not what Ezra Loomis saw, which was not ugly or useless or unfortunate, which was, she told me, something worth protecting. I protected it. For 4 years in a house that had decided I was nothing, I protected it by being exactly what they needed me to be on the surface and exactly what I chose to be underneath it. And when the underneath was ready, I brought it up and showed the Loomis plantation what it had been living with without knowing. The whole plantation feared me by the end. Not because they knew what I had done. They didn't. Nobody knew except Solomon and the 2 people in the information network and August in Demopolis, and the memory of my mother's face the night she told me I was worth protecting. They feared me because of what the plantation had become in the years I was in it, because of the tightening, The strain, the quality in the air that told anyone paying attention that something was wrong, but could not tell them what or why or where it had started. That quality in the air was real. It had a source. The source was me working methodically and patiently and invisibly at the structure of the thing that held all of us inside it. They feared what they could feel but not see. They were right to.
This is the story of Cora, an enslaved house servant on the Loomis Plantation in Marengo County, Alabama, whose 4-year systematic campaign against her enslavers' financial and business relationships produced the collapse and forced sale of the Loomis operation in 1858. Marengo County courthouse records document the legal proceedings of 1858 and the subsequent sale of the Loomis Plantation's land, equipment, and enslaved population to satisfy outstanding debts. No official record names Cora as a contributing factor. The factor in Mobile, the merchant in Selma, and the note holder in Montgomery all reduced or terminated their business relationships with Ezra Loomis during 1857, the year preceding the formal proceedings. Cora was sold in the dispersal of the Loomis enslaved population and eventually freed in 1865, settling in Greensboro, Alabama. She died in 1891. Her story was preserved in the oral tradition of the Greensboro free black community and passed down through the women who had known her in her later years, who described her consistently as a woman who said very little and understood everything, and who, when she did speak, said exactly what she meant and nothing more. Solomon, the gin mechanic whose knowledge of the Loomis Gin House was the technical foundation of the 1857 harvest shortfall, was sold to a plantation in Pickens County in the dispersal. He was freed in 1865 and established a machine repair business in Tuscaloosa that operated until his death in 1883. He and Cora corresponded for the rest of their lives. Their letters, preserved by Cora's great-niece, contain no reference to what they did. They contain instead the ordinary contents of a correspondence between two people who survived something together and who did not need to speak about it to know that they both remembered it completely. If Cora's story moves in you, the recognition of a woman who understood that the most powerful position available to her was the one that nobody was watching, subscribe now and join a community dedicated to the voices that history filed under insignificant and forgot to look at again. These are the stories of the women they called ugly, the women they called useless, the women they stopped watching because they had already decided what they were and felt no need to look again. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what Cora means to you. Because the thing about being underestimated is that it is only a disadvantage if you let it be. And Cora did not let it be. For 4 years in a house that had decided she was nothing, she let them have that decision, and she used every second of the freedom it gave her